You know what everyone says about HITC Sevens? No, not that he makes 40-minute documentaries about the Zimbabwean fifth tier that no one cares about, or that he shoehorns Hull City references into videos with precisely zero relevance to the club. I am referring, of course, to this channel's reputation of listening to the people who matter the most. All of you, magnificent viewers and subscribers. I mean, don't get me wrong, I do most of the heavy lifting, working 18-hour days, 7 days a week, to churn out masterpieces such as this. But it would be a total waste of time if none of you watched them, and I would be in arrears on my mortgage repayments. I digress. The point being, HITC Sevens wasn't nicknamed the People's Channel for nothing, so when FIFA pack openings received the most upvotes on a video with his suggestion that I attempt to pick out every Premier League team's best player now and their best player 7 years ago, and then compare the two, well, how could I possibly say no? Even if Ragazzo Italiano thought that it sounded so boring. Little intro is required with this one, except for all that babble that I've just vomited out. I think the premise ought to be pretty self-explanatory and straightforward, though picking out the best player now and from the 2014-15 season for each club, along with who is the better player between the two, was anything but. Still, I've given it my best shot, so let's just see how we get on. Arsenal. KIERAN Tierney versus ALEXIS Sanchez. It's a bit of a mismatch to get us started, though I must admit, picking Arsenal's best player right now is a fairly tough task. I don't say that to demean the current Arsenal squad, there is plenty of talent in there, in spite of their poor start, there just isn't one clear individual who stands out head and shoulders above the rest. On talent alone, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang is a strong contender, but it's hard to pick him off the back of the last 18 months. Ultimately, 9 times out of 10, when you watch Arsenal, KIERAN Tierney is very solid at the least, and spectacular at best. I think he's an excellent left-back, and both Arsenal's most consistent, and probably their most important player. But he really is no match for Alexis Sanchez 7 years ago, who was, at that time, quite possibly the best player in the Premier League. A terrier-like wide forward, Sanchez was Arsenal's talisman, constantly driving them forward and coming up with 37 goal contributions from 52 appearances. So, he comfortably gets us started at the Emirates. Aston Villa. Emi Martinez versus Christian Benteke. Alright, hear me out on this one because it is near enough impossible to compare a goalkeeper with a centre forward. It must be said that picking Aston Villa's best player following the sale of Jack Grealish is a pretty difficult task. And I'm a big fan of Ezri Konsa, John McGinn, and Ollie Watkins. Heck, even Emi Buendia could be in with a shout, though I think it would be pretty controversial to award him that title quite so early on in his Villa career. Ultimately, I went with another Argentine named Emi, namely Emi Martinez, who has been utterly superb for both Arsenal and Aston Villa ever since Bernd Leno's injury for the former during the season before last. He is up against Christian Benteke, who had 3 fantastic seasons at Villa Park, averaging almost a goal every other game, and all but ensuring Villa's survival. I think Benteke was more important to that Villa team than Martinez is to this one, but I think Martinez is a better goalkeeper right now than Benteke ever was a centre forward, albeit only just. This is a tough one, but my gut tells me to go with Martinez. Brentford. Ivan Toney versus Andre Gray. An easier comparison, because it's between 2 strikers, it is picking out Brentford's best player from 7 years ago that presents more of a challenge here, since I could easily have gone with James Tarkowski, who I remember being brilliant that season, or Alan Judge, who was among the best playmakers in the Championship before suffering a shattering injury setback. In the here and now, I thought Ethan Pinnock was outstanding last season, but ultimately, both now and 7 years ago, if you asked most people who Brentford's star man was, or indeed is, they'd have picked out their top scorers. I think Ivan Toney has a bit more about him and is better equipped for life in the Premier League than Andre Gray was. So it is the former Newcastle United man who gets the nod from me, and not just because I am still bitter about Burnley signing Andre Gray ahead of Hull City. Brighton and Hove Albion. Lewis Dunk versus Lewis Dunk. I promise you I didn't do this for comic effect, but I think Brighton's best player from 7 years ago might just be the same man as their best player right now. You could certainly make a case for Yves Bissouma being the most talented player in the Seagulls squad, and even their most important. And I would tend to agree, given their lack of genuine alternatives to the Malian when it comes to pulling the strings in midfield. But I still think Dunk is a better centre-back than Bissouma is a central midfielder. So it is Dunk versus Dunk, and naturally, I'm going for Dunk. 2021 Dunk, that is, rather than 2014 Dunk, who had only just managed to re-establish himself back at the Amex at that time. Burnley. Nick Pope versus Kieran Trippier. It's a tough call between Danny Ings and Kieran Trippier as Burnley's best player 7 years ago, and I would not argue with anyone who opted for Ings instead. I always thought Kieran Trippier was so important to Sean Dyche's side as a creative outlet down their right flank, but both players have gone on to prove their class at other clubs since leaving Lancashire's highest ranked club at this moment in time. Right now, James Tarkowski and Dwight McNeil have to be mentioned, the former earning himself his second honourable mention in this video, and probably Chris Wood as well. But subscribers to this channel will know all too well the high regard that I hold Nick Pope in. For that reason, it won't come as any great surprise that I've picked him as the Claret's best player right now, and nor will it that I've picked him ahead of Trippier as well. Chelsea. N'Golo Kante versus Eden Hazard. There was a staggering amount of talent in Chelsea's 2014-15 squad, just as there is now, and Thomas Tuchel's side will have ambitions to replicate Jose Mourinho's Premier League title win from 7 years ago this season. If they manage to do so, it will be Chelsea's first Premier League title win without Eden Hazard since the 2009-10 season. And the brilliant Belgian, who bewildered defenders for 7 years at Stamford Bridge, is the obvious choice as Chelsea's best 7 years ago. N'Golo Kante faces stiff competition from the likes of Romelu Lukaku, Kai Havertz, and Mason Mount right now, but whoever you pick, it is a little bit academic, because Eden Hazard was seriously special 7 years ago, and he beats them all in my book. Crystal Palace. Wilfried Zaha versus Wilfried Zaha. In a repeat of the Brighton situation, coincidentally occurring in the case of Brighton's biggest rivals, I am not 100% convinced that Wilfried Zaha was Crystal Palace's best player 7 years ago, nor am I even that he is their best player now. Certainly, he was their most talented player in 2014-15, though you could argue that Mile Jedinak and Scott Dan were even more important. And now, I think Eberechi Eze has just as much raw talent, and Palace's Player of the Year last season, Vicente Guaita, surely deserves to be in the conversation. On the balance of things, I did still go with Zaha for the double, and as with Dunk, it is the current version that I would take in the case of the Ivorian international. Everton. Dominic Calvert-Lewin versus Romelu Lukaku. I don't think Romelu Lukaku was Everton's best performer in the 2014-15 season. That title would have to go to any one of Phil Jagielka, John Stones, or Leighton Baines. But I still think that he was their best player, if that makes any sense. Likewise, there are perhaps one or two more gifted players in this current Toffee squad than Dominic Calvert-Lewin, but he is nonetheless their star man and their most important asset. Picking between these two at these respective stages in their careers is extremely difficult. Dominic Calvert-Lewin scored more Premier League goals last season than Lukaku did in 14-15, but the Belgian did score more in all competitions. For consistency, I would be tempted by Calvert-Lewin, but I still think Lukaku was the superior all-round centre-forward who presented a more terrifying proposition to play against when he was really at the races. Leeds United. Kalvin Phillips versus Alex Mowatt. There is a case to be made that Rafinha is the best player in this current Leeds United squad in terms of raw ability, but different positions require different skill sets, obviously, and on the balance of things, I think it is pretty difficult to argue with the fact that Kalvin Phillips is, right now, the best player at Leeds United. Alex Mowatt takes the crown from 7 years ago, narrowly ahead of Rudolf Austin, who was briefly adored at Ellen Road. Mowatt was an impressive youngster at Leeds and is a very good midfielder, but Phillips takes this one without a moment's hesitation. Leicester City. Youri Tielemans versus Esteban Cambiasso. An interesting one, Leicester City's 2014-15 campaign was their great escape season, where they relied upon the defensive might of Wes Morgan and Robert Huth, the flickering brilliance of Riyad Mahrez, and the sheer talent and nous of Esteban Cambiasso in midfield during the run-in to stay in the Premier League. Cambiasso was outstanding that season, rightly picking up the Foxes Player of the Year award, in what was his only season at the King Power Stadium. There is no real standout player at Leicester City right now, or at least I don't think so, from Kasper Schmeichel all the way through to Jamie Vardy. But I think Youri Tielemans is the most talented player at the club, and the one, at least, among established players at the club, and probably discounting Wesley Fofana, with the highest ceiling. Cambiasso was brilliant in 14-15, but I think Tielemans now is a better footballer than Cambiasso was in his last hurrah, so he takes this one. Liverpool. Mohamed Salah versus Philippe Coutinho. I think this is among the most straightforward decisions, on all fronts, in this entire video. You could maybe make a case for Virgil van Dijk ahead of Mohamed Salah right now, but I wouldn't, and Philippe Coutinho was simply head and shoulders above every other Liverpool player, not literally of course, 7 years ago. I also think it is a pretty easy decision between Salah and Coutinho, and the answer there is Mohamed Salah. Coutinho might sometimes have been easier on the eye and have scored more aesthetically pleasing goals on a more frequent basis, but Salah is far more efficient, clinical, and is just the better player, in my humble opinion at least. Manchester City. Kevin De Bruyne versus Sergio Aguero. A heck of a strong comparison. Kevin De Bruyne in 2021 and Sergio Aguero in 2014 are two of the finest players of their generations, pretty much at their respective peaks. The 2014-15 season was Sergio Aguero's most prolific Premier League campaign, as he struck 26 times in the league, winning the Golden Boot, and 32 times in 42 games in all competitions. Kevin De Bruyne, meanwhile, is, I think, the best midfielder in world football right now. And whilst it feels like a bold claim to make, I do think that he's capable of going down as being the greatest midfielder that English football has seen during the Premier League era. Both would arguably make World 11s in their respective seasons, but whilst Aguero's inclusion would be very much debatable, De Bruyne would be one of the first names on the team sheet. So it is the Belgian who gets the nod from me, up against his former teammate. Honourable mentions have to go to David Silva and Yaya Toure 7 years ago, who just missed out to Aguero at the peak of his powers. Though, I don't think that there can be too many debates about De Bruyne being the Citizens' standout player right now. Manchester United. Cristiano Ronaldo versus David de Gea. I ummed and ahed over this one for a while, partly because I somehow briefly forgot that Cristiano Ronaldo had returned to Manchester United, despite the fact that they have announced it about 875 times on Twitter, so I was comparing Bruno Fernandes with David de Gea. I think there is an argument to be had between Fernandes and Ronaldo, obviously not in terms of their talent or overall careers, but if you asked Manchester United fans which one they would most like to see in their starting 11 now, I suspect many would say Fernandes for understandable reasons. The drop-off from Ronaldo to Cavani, I would suggest, is not actually as steep or damaging to Manchester United's chances of winning a game right now as the drop-off from Fernandes to Donny van de Beek. Between Ronaldo and De Gea, we really cannot forget just how special David De Gea was 7 seasons ago, winning Manchester United double-digit points across the course of a season and single-handedly keeping them in the hunt for a top-4 finish at times. He was arguably the best goalkeeper in the world at the time, and again, I would say he was more important to Manchester United then than Ronaldo is to them now. But that isn't the question, and on the grounds of who is the best, I would still, very narrowly, lean towards Ronaldo, even at the age of 36. Newcastle United. ALLAN SAINT-MAXIMIN versus PAPISS CISSE. I think this might be quite a controversial one, and it is not easy picking out Newcastle United's best player either 7 years ago or now. Right now, I have gone for ALLAN SAINT-MAXIMIN ahead of the likes of Joe Willock and Callum Wilson. The Frenchman is undoubtedly Newcastle's most talented player, and his ability on the ball is simply frightening at times. No doubt he still has plenty of room to improve, but he is the one genuine spark of excitement and creativity in this current Newcastle United team, so I think it is reasonable to call him their best player. PAPISS CISSE I have picked ahead of Moussa Sissoko and Daryl Janmaat, the latter of whom was outstanding in the 2014-15 season. But despite his inconsistencies, PAPISS CISSE was absolutely deadly when he was at the races. He scored 11 goals in 21 Premier League games that season, and only Sergio Aguero had a better record in terms of minutes per goal. SAINT-MAXIMIN is much more gifted, and should go on to achieve far more within the game. But at these respective timestamps in their careers, I feel obliged, again, perhaps controversially, to go with CISSE. Norwich City. TEEMU PUKKI versus Bradley Johnson. A very difficult one. Norwich City's best player last season was quite obviously Emi Martinez, and you could make a case for any one of Todd Cantwell, Grant Hanley, Milo Rashica, heck, even Billy Gilmore being the best player at the club now. But I have gone with TEEMU PUKKI. Sure, he might not score as many goals in the Premier League as the Championship, but who does? He struck 26 times for the Canaries last season, and only had one goal contribution fewer than the indomitable Buendia, thus making him difficult to overlook. Likewise, Bradley Johnson sees off the challenges of then top scorer Cameron Jerome and lead creator Wes Hoolahan, partly by virtue of the extraordinary number of goals that he scored from midfield that season. The former Leeds United star smashed in 15 goals, enough to win him the club's Player of the Year award, but not enough for me to say that he was a better player then than TEEMU PUKKI is now. I don't think. Southampton. James Ward-Prowse versus Jose Fonte. Picking the best player at Southampton right now is probably the easiest decision I'll make this year, let alone in this video. But picking out the Saints main man 7 years ago is a bit of a trickier task. My first thought was actually Sadio Mane, but it was the following season that he reached another level. Though in truth, I could easily have picked any one of Mane, Nathaniel Klein, Morgan Schneiderlin, Toby Alderweireld, Victor Wanyama, or Graziano Pella. I chose Jose Fonte ahead of all of them though, which might seem crazy now, but wouldn't have done at all at the time. Fonte was a top 5 centre-back in the Premier League that season, and rightly won Southampton's Player of the Year award. Still, I'm taking Ward-Prowse ahead of him, and I think most Saints fans would agree, as good as Jose Fonte was. Tottenham Hotspur, Harry Kane versus Harry Kane. The third and final instance of a player facing their former selves in this video, this was a pretty easy one. Christian Eriksen was brilliant in the 2014-15 season, and Son Heung-min is borderline world-class right now, by almost any definition of the term. But Harry Kane was and is better than both of them. The 2014-15 season was Kane's breakout campaign, as injuries forced him into Mauricio Pochettino's starting 11, and he had an impact no one could have anticipated, bagging 31 goals in all competitions and coming second only to Sergio Aguero in the Premier League scoring charts. Those are magnificent numbers, but the reality is that Kane is a far superior player now than he was then. He scored even more goals, 33, in all competitions last season, as well as topping both the Premier League's goal and assist charts. Simply put, Kane is one of the best and most deadly centre-forwards in the world, and it is his 2021 self that takes this one. Watford. Ismaila Sarr versus Troy Deeney. A pretty testing dilemma between two completely contrasting footballers who are very difficult to compare. To start with, I'll just say that I don't think too many Watford fans would contest the idea that Ismaila Sarr is the club's star man now, and that the recently departed club legend Troy Deeney was their talisman in 2014-15. Ultimately, whilst it is like chalk and cheese with these two, my assessment would be that Sarr is the more talented player with an infinitely higher ceiling, aged only 23, but that Deeney was the better player back in the 2014-15 season in terms of his all-round contribution to Watford's play. He struck 21 times in 41 games in the Championship that season, winning his second successive Watford Player of the Season award and inspiring the Hornets to promotion. And the goal statistics alone, whilst impressive, don't come close to telling the full story of Deeney's impact and influence at that time. West Ham United. Declan Rice versus Stuart Downing. a really difficult one, I think I would pick Declan Rice out ahead of Tomas Souček for West Ham right now, as the Englishman continues to kick on. But it's a tougher call between two Englishmen from 7 seasons ago for the Hammers. Aaron Cresswell, who is still starring for West Ham now, I believe won the Hammer of the Year award in what was his first season at Upton Park 7 years ago, and I could easily have gone with him. I very narrowly went with fellow Englishman Stuart Downing instead though, who had looked fairly uninspiring during his 2 seasons with Liverpool, but enjoyed a brilliant renaissance after moving into a central role as a sort of number 10 under Sam Allardyce at West Ham. 6 goals and 8 assists reflects his general involvement, but it was Downing's vision and technique that saw him flourish in that position, and even earned him a recall to the England squad after a couple of years out in the cold. Nonetheless, it's very obviously Rice who takes this one. Wolves. Ruben Neves versus Benteke. I think it is fair to say that Ruben Neves is Wolves' best player right now, though I'm sure some would lean towards Raul Jimenez once he gets fully back up to speed, and when he's really at it, Adama Traore is one of the most unplayable players in the Premier League. I think Neves is the right call though. Meanwhile, back in the 2014-15 season, Wolves very narrowly missed out on a playoff spot in the Championship, with centre-back Richard Stearman, now of Derby County, winning the Player of the Season award, but it was their front three of Benteke, Bakary Sakho and Nuwa Dicko who took all the headlines. Sakho notched the most goal contributions, but only because Afobe was out injured for much of that season, and the London-born DR Congo international was undoubtedly Wolves' star man at that time in my eyes. He scored 13 goals in just 21 games that season, which is an outstanding record, but as much as I have sung his praises, being lethal in the Championship is not enough to be considered a superior player to Ruben Neves, who becomes the final winner in our Premier League 2014-15 versus 2021-22 best player at every club head-to-head. Thank you all very much as ever for watching, and to FIFA Pack Openings, if that was his name, for the video suggestion. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on social media, on Twitter and Instagram, via the username at HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.